Good morning and welcome along to this webinar from the Scottish Fiscal Commission. So I'm Graham Roy and I'm Chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you along to this webinar. We were talking about our report that came out yesterday, Fiscal Sustainability and Climate Change, and looking at climate change mitigation. So what we've planned for the webinar today is that I will give you a brief overview of the publication, some of the key findings, and then we'll move to some Q&A. And I'm joined by colleague Gregor, who will also be on hand to answer all the difficult questions that we get in the Q&A. So what we'll do is we'll just go straight into it, and we'll give you a broad overview of our findings and what the key conclusions are. So before we do that, just a bit of background about the Scottish Fiscal Commission. So we're Scotland's independent budget authority, and we look at how we support the Scottish Government's budget cycle on a regular basis. But we also look at some of the big fiscal public finance challenges and opportunities that are facing Scotland beyond the immediate budget horizon. And in the past year, we've looked at issues around demographics and health, and now here we're talking about climate change mitigation, and this updates some of our work that we did last year. And the key motivation for this is that we know that the Scottish Government and the UK Government have clear targets to try and achieve net zero in Scotland by 2045, in the UK by 2050. And that's going to require significant investment by the public sector into different aspects of climate change mitigation. And that is going to have some challenges for the public finances. And we'll walk through our estimates of how significant these investments are going to be. So we'll talk you through all of that, and as I said, we'll then move to the opportunity for some questions in Slido. So there's the link to Slido. There's the code as well. So do feel free to start putting your questions into Slido, and then when we come to the end, we'll pick up the questions as we go. Okay, so what motivates us to look at the issues of climate change for the Scottish budget? And clearly climate change is the most significant and greatest environmental challenge, even society challenge that we face as a country, and it'll have different impacts upon the public finances. So, you know, a warming climate and a rapidly warming climate will lead to damages for our economy that will have an impact on the public finances through higher public expenditure or through lower tax revenues. And the OBR estimate that we could see about an 8% drop in GDP relative to what it could be by 2070 if temperatures are to rise by 3 degrees, and that is largely through increased environmental disasters, increased flood protection costs. All the different elements are going to have a significant impact, damaging impact upon the economy. Alongside that, we know that whatever we do in terms of trying to mitigate the rise in temperature, that temperatures have risen and they're likely to rise in the near term, and we're going to have to adapt to that warmer climate. And that's going to mean more long-term investment in preventative spending, whether that be elements around, as I mentioned, flood protection to try and shore up our defences against that, but also just in general to cope with a warmer climate. And these investments are not insignificant. Again, the estimate for the UK is about £10 billion of additional investment per year needed in adapting into the warmer climate. And then we also have the thing that we're going to look at today, which is mitigation, which is what do we actually need to do to invest over the long term in order to reduce our emissions, and that's going to be the focus of our discussion today, and it's going to set out essentially where the investment is going to be needed in our economy in order to make sure that we can actually meet our targets to hit net zero. What's changed since our report that we did back in this time last year? Well, quite a bit has changed in terms of the underlying analysis and evidence base, and also the politics of what's happened to the debate around net zero. So you might remember this time last year, Scottish Government's approach to looking at the climate change was to essentially have an annual target and a pathway that would take it towards net zero. You may also recall that the Committee for Climate Change said that the target the government had to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030 was no longer credible, and that led to the government essentially revising its plans there. At the same time, we've started to move away from relying on an annual fixed target to move to this concept of carbon budgets. And essentially, carbon budgets are the maximum amount of emissions that could be emitted over a set period of time if we are to meet our objectives around achieving net zero by 2045. So it's a bit more of a kind of sensible approach to trying to manage that overall transition to net zero by taking a slightly kind of more medium-term look at the overall reduction in emissions that are needed, rather than have volatility being impacted by what might happen year on year if there's, for example, a particularly cold winter or there's some shock to the economy that has an impact on emissions in a particular year. So we move towards these what are called carbon budgets, and the Committee for Climate Change, the Climate Change Committee, has updated its assessments about the overall investment that is needed into the economy, into the public sector, in order to meet these carbon budgets, in order to meet our long-term net zero targets. And to give you an idea, these carbon budgets are talking about over the 2031-35 period of looking for about nearly a 70% reduction in emissions relative to 1990 levels, rising to about 80% reduction in emissions by 2036, 2040. And that gives you the scale of overall reduction that is needed. This is also really important because we're awaiting the Scottish Government's climate change plan, which is due to be published later on in the year. And that also plays into the spending review, which is likely to take place, if not the end of this year, early next year. So it's a really important time for the government to link all what it's planning to do in terms of its climate change ambitions with its spending priorities and public finance priorities over the next few years. So that's the Scottish context. The second thing I want to touch on, which is key in our report, is to really understand that when we're talking here about the Scottish context, and we're talking here about Scottish Government priorities and plans, the nature of devolution, both in terms of policy responsibility, but also in terms of a fiscal responsibility angle, means that the efforts that the UK and Scotland do to try and achieve net zero are interdependent. And that's because we know that reserved areas of policy, as well as devolved areas of policy, will have an impact on both the targets here in Scotland, but also in the UK. So, for example, if we are to achieve net zero in Scotland, that's going to rely on some big decisions that are going to be taken at the UK level around electricity supply, around things like aviation, things like road tax charges. All of those things are going to be really important for what is going to be the emissions impact here in Scotland. Of course, what matters also is what the Scottish Government does in terms of investments in things like public transport, in terms of buildings, both domestic buildings and also non-domestic buildings. And one of the interesting things that we touch on in our report is if you look at the level of public investments needed, actually the majority of that public investment is going to be needed within devolved areas of responsibilities. Over 80% of that investment is going to have to come from within devolved areas. But that, again, is not to say that there isn't interdependencies between what's happening between Scotland and the rest of the UK, because we know that a large part of the ability of the Scottish Government to spend money in key areas depends upon how much money is spent in equivalent areas in the rest of the UK. So given the way that the Scottish Government is funded, and still the largest element of funding for the Scottish budget is through the Barnett formula, how much money the Scottish Government has got to invest in these high impact areas of tackling climate change and achieving net zero will depend significantly on how much the Scottish Government, the UK Government spends, and that passes through the Barnett formula. So there's not just interactions in a policy area, but also interactions in terms of a public finance area as well. So how much the UK government spends in some key areas. When do they spend that money in some key areas? What's the timing of all of that? And that will have an impact on Scotland. And of course, it's a two-way street. So what the Scottish Government does will also have an impact on the UK's ability to achieve net zero, not just the fact that Scotland is a significant part of the UK, but also because we have some key areas where the UK's ability to achieve net zero is going to be dependent upon what happens in Scotland, for example, around land use. And Scotland's relatively large land mass in the overall UK context is going to be a significant driver. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea about setting the scene about why we're doing this work, the importance of this work, and also the areas of focus that we're going to look at. So as I said, what we do in our report is essentially try and estimate what is going to be the likely investment that is needed by the devolved public sector in Scotland in order to achieve our ambitions about hitting net zero by 2045. So essentially what we do is that we say, okay, let's assume that the Scottish Government is on a trajectory in order to achieve net zero by 2045. So let's assume that that investment needs to take place, and it does, and it does take place. So what we want to do is essentially estimate over these carbon budget periods how much is that investment going to be, and what are the areas of focus that it's going to have to depend upon. So to do that, what we do is we make use of some great work by the Climate Change Committee to essentially look at the overall investment that is needed within the UK, so the total economy investment in the UK. They also estimate the total economy investment needed within Scotland, so we can use that sort of information as well. What they also provide really helpfully is the amount of public sector investment is going to be needed in the UK. So we take all of that information as our starting point, and we look at what's the total investment that is likely needed both at an economy-wide level in the UK and in Scotland, and crucially within the UK context, what is the level of public investment that's needed. So the first task for us then is to estimate how much do we think of that public investment is likely to be needed here in Scotland, and we can triangulate that by looking at Scotland's share of the overall investment needed, the whole economy investment needed. So we can come up with an estimated kind of share of Scotland's public investment that is required. What we can then do is make a judgment call about whether that public investment is going to be in devolved areas or in reserved areas. And we look at what's the relative proportion of spending in some of these big ticket items. So for example, in domestic housing, for example, that's pretty much a devolved area of expenditure. So we can assume that that is largely going to be a burden on the Scottish Government, but where maybe there's potentially expenditures at the UK level and things like manufacturing subsidies or things like that, that would be more in the reserved area. So we take the overall investment in the UK, public investment, we work out a Scottish share of that, and then we decide what's the proportion of that that's likely to be devolved versus likely to be reserved. And all of that, pulling all of that together, gives us an overall estimate of Scotland's public expenditure, and crucially, the public expenditure investment that's needed in a devolved context. So that's the methodology that we deploy. And what are the key results that we find? So this chart breaks down the investment that is needed in 5-year chunks. It's all in real terms. So it's adjusted for inflation, and it gives you an idea about the scale of investment. So if you look over that kind of over the period up to 2050, you're looking at investment in buildings of over £13 billion, about 80% of that in residential, about 20% of that in non-residential, transport investment of over £3 billion. And these are sustained investments that need to take place over the next 20, 25 years in order for us to hit net zero. And you'll see a couple of points which are quite interesting here. So first of all, there's quite a lot of upfront investment. So investment needed to take place over the next parliamentary term, but also then the next parliamentary term but one is when a lot of this expenditure is going to peak as we ramp up the decarbonisation of our building stock, and we ramp up the decarbonisation of our public transport. In general, I'll talk about this in a second, but one of the things that we find in our report is that given Scotland's housing stock, given our cooler climate, it's likely that the level of investment is likely to be higher in Scotland than other parts of the UK. And I would just a wee bit about a wee reflection on the land use and agriculture. And you might recall from our report last year, we talked quite a bit about this. And you might see that the figures for land use and agriculture are slightly smaller, are actually smaller, significantly smaller than what we estimated last time. But this is quite important subtle point here, where what we see is the overall economy investment in land use is still, is still significant and still high. But what we're able to do now here is start to use some of the CCCs, thinking about how much of this investment will be net investment and how much of this will be gross investment. So how much of this investment might be able to be sourced from displacing subsidies elsewhere in the terms of the use of land in agriculture. So maybe reduction in subsidies for agriculture, increasing into subsidies that are going into land use and decarbonisation of land use. So that's an area we touch on in the report. We explore it a bit more. It's an area of quite significant uncertainty because it obviously relies on quite significant policy choices to effectively divert some subsidies from existing land use into other types of land use. So that's going to be an area which is going to be quite a significant policy challenge or policy area to focus upon over the next few years. So that gives you, I guess, a scale of that overall investment. Works out around about an average over £700 million per annum. So not an insignificant amount of money. And crucially, the next Parliament is going to have to deal with a lot of those challenges and set out a clear plan for that investment if Scotland is to achieve its net zero objectives. One thing we touch on in the report as well is where there might be some sensitivity around some of these assumptions. So what we've got here is just different scenarios, just to give you an idea about how much investment might be needed if the government choose to make different choices about the level of public sector involvement in achieving net zero. Because clearly, the investment we're talking about is a whole economy investment. So some of it will be from the private sector, some will be from consumers, and some of it will be from the public sector. And our central scenario that we set out in the report takes pretty much a middle ground in the balance between the public sector and the private sector. There are clearly different options within that. So it could be the case that, for example, the government say that they want to basically invest significantly and provide lots of support to households to invest in decarbonisation of the housing stock, and that would lead you to more on the upper scenario. Or it could be that the government say, well, apart from social housing, all investment in decarbonisation of buildings needs to be undertaken by consumers or by the private sector, and that would move you more to the lower section. So what we're really trying to do here is not really give an exact projection about a different scenario, but really to say is that government have got a bit of flexibility here in terms of their investments, but that will come with really quite big important policy choices and also political choices as well about who bears the burden of the investment that we need in order to achieve net zero. So that gives you an idea about some of the kind of scalability and the effects that are going on here. One final thing I wanted just to touch on before moving into some of the kind of the broad conclusions that I think that we come up with is that in the report, what we do is we do a bit of a comparison about whether we think that spending in Scotland is likely to be higher on a per person basis than in the rest of the UK. And it's clear, at least from our reading of the evidence in the Committee on Climate Change and running through the numbers, is that we think that on average, spending per person is likely to be higher than the rest of the UK. And there's some kind of good reasons for that. I mean, first of all, our climate is cooler. So it's likely to be that there's likely to be more investment needed in energy efficiency and supporting residential buildings for the fact that we have a cooler climate. We also have a bit more social housing in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. So if, on a kind of relatively neutral scenario, we assume that the investment in decarbonisation of buildings for social housing is funded by the public sector, that would be a slightly bigger cost here in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. We also have slightly more non-residential buildings on a per capita basis in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. As I touched on earlier, we have a bigger land mass in Scotland relative to our population. So we've got around 2/3 of the UK peatlands, and we've got around about a third of the UK's land mass. So clearly, if you're going to have to invest significantly in land use, given our geography is bigger than our population share, then it necessarily follows that that is going to be a relative higher cost in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. And that throws up some really interesting public policy and public finance questions, because if a large amount of funding that Scotland will receive or will be able to draw upon for these investments is based upon Barnett's or population shares of equivalent spending elsewhere in the rest of the UK, then it means that the Scottish Government is going to have to find other sources, either from within its existing budget or other areas of revenue raising, in order to essentially make the investments that are needed in order for Scotland to hit the 2045 target. So one final thing, just to conclude before we open it up to questions, is I guess what happens next with all of this. So what we've tried to do is really be quite analytical in setting out where we think that the scale of investment is likely to be needed in order for Scotland to hit its 2045 target, and what's the role of the devolved public sector in all of that. And crucially set out where is that investment likely to take place. The Scottish Government has got plans to publish its climate change plan toward the end of the year, and this will be setting out the policies that it's going to put in place in order to meet these carbon budgets and achieve net zero. And I guess one of the key conclusions that we're seeing from our report today is that the numbers that we've published and we published yesterday essentially set the overall scale of that investment. So the climate change plan really needs to essentially step up and be quite clear about how emissions will be reduced, where that investment is going to be prioritised, how is it matching the numbers that we have set out or the overall ambition that we have set out, and what are the associated costs and benefits that are going to be involved in all of this. And also, crucially, how is it going to manage some of these differences between Scotland and the UK that we've highlighted in terms of relative prioritisation, different policy priorities, or actually just differences in geography or differences in terms of the underlying housing stock or the underlying economic base. And over the course, this all comes together and sits alongside the big spending review that the government are going to be doing over the next few months. So clearly what we need is not just the climate change to have clear plans and policies set out, but for them to be consistent and for them to be then fed through into the spending review so that we can have clear plans for how the government plan to set out policies on reducing emissions, but how is that going to be funded? Where is the spending taking place, and how is that all going to be paid for? So it's going to be a really interesting time. It's a really important time for the government to essentially set out its ambitions and plans for how we're going to achieve net zero by 2045. So hopefully that's given you a broad overview of our report yesterday, and it's given you a flavour of some of the issues that we're highlighting, some of the questions we're posing that we don't have the answer to, about areas that are potentially useful for government to focus upon. And it'd be really great to spend some time with you just picking up any of the questions that you have. So there's the Slido code, there's the QR code. And what I'll do is I'll just stop sharing my slides so you can see myself and Gregor, and we'll come to the questions. Great. Okay. Brilliant. Okay, so we've got some questions here, and maybe I'll pick the first one about how have our costs changed since the previous report, since we did in 2040, I've got 2045 in my head, in 2024. So maybe, Gregor, I'll ask you just to explain a wee bit just about the technical aspects that have changed the numbers. There is actually quite a helpful table in the report where we set out our numbers relative to 2024 and where things have changed. Broadly speaking, some of it comes through methodology, some of it comes through reassessments by the committee, by the Climate Change Committee about the level of investment that's needed, and a mixture then of just updating data and progress. But Greg, I don't know if you want to say a bit more about the particular methods that we've deployed.
Yeah, so one of the major changes is that the update the Climate Change Committee have made for their estimates of how much for the whole economy to transition to net zero will cost have significantly fallen from their sixth carbon budget to their seventh carbon budget, which we're now using. The whole economy cost for Scotland has fallen from 135 billion to 68 billion. So it is a significant decrease in the expected cost of transitioning to net zero. And that has fed through to some of our devolved costs. And this is for a handful of reasons. One being that there's been technology advances since their last report that they weren't expecting. There's also just naturally the time frame adjustment that we've now moved 4 years further, so that time's taken out. So that additional cost, what has been baked into the baseline, is quite different. But also one major factor is that the price of energy has shot up in that period because they produced their report in 2020, and we've had some energy price shocks, and that means that the marginal cost of using fossil fuels is higher than it was, and the transition away from that is now lower. So that's looking at the overall costing for the whole economy, and what that is fed through to our report on devolved spending, and that's one of the major reasons why it's fallen. The other factor is that we're now using the Climate Change Committee's estimates of public investment shares, and they've gone into a bit more detail from what we previously had, because there wasn't that public investment set out by the Scottish Government yet, and we still are waiting on from the climate change plan. So we've now incorporated those costings in, and that public investment from the UK, and then taking a Scottish share of that. And that's where the point about land use is feeding through, is that there are quite different assumptions on land use in our latest report than our previous report. But what that kind of highlights is that there's quite a lot of uncertainty in this area without Scottish Government policy. So that once we have that, we'll be able to assess what that means for the fiscal risks.
Great, excellent. Thanks, Gregor. Yeah, and I was just looking at some of the questions coming through on Slido there, and there's a really good question, I think, which builds on that from Neil about, can we expand a bit about the land use cost assumptions and just what was assumed previously and what was assumed now. And I think I guess the key point, well, one key point, and maybe we can explain a bit more about the methodology. The key point is that apart from the Climate Change Committee just changing some of the overall investment, I think reducing it slightly, the whole economy investment in land use is still a very, very large number. And that is an opportunity in Scotland in many ways, because it's going to be a significant investment, particularly in rural parts of the country. But one of the things that's quite interesting is reflections about where that money comes from and how much of this is new investment, so additional top-up investment versus essentially redirected investment. And Greg, I don't know if you want to maybe say a bit more about that aspect to it, because it does raise quite, I think, a really interesting policy question about where does that additional investment flow from?
Yes. So previously, we'd assumed 100% of that additional investment, and this is based on the OBR's assumptions on the Climate Change Committee's overall costings. Now we've got a bit more detail from what the CCC in their policies, and what's coming through is that they've made an assumption that there'll be some of that cost will be come from redistribution of subsidies to farmers, and especially due to livestock. One thing, though, is, as you're saying, is that the overall investment needed for Scotland is still slightly reduced by the scale-ish thing that the CCC have adjusted, but overall still super significant and very significant. And we still see the massive differences between Scotland and the rest of the UK. So that will still cause pressure on the Scottish budget. But that element of that change is to do with that assumption, and whether that is something the Scottish government want to go with is something they've already signalled that they will not be going on the path along with peatlands and agricultural subsidies along with livestock. So it is less likely that netting off will actually happen in this area within the government policy. So it is quite a heavy assumption, but is because without the climate change plan set out, it's the best data we've got to make these estimates.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the point is it's largely the neutral assumption about this is essentially what the CCC are saying in terms of this is potentially a UK level, so we do that for consistency. But we highlight actually this does require quite a significant kind of policy action in order to be willing to do that, and that will raise some really quite important questions about whether that is the right policy, whether that is you want to take something different. And I guess the key point about when we discuss like the range of public investment options, then you can do much more heavy lifting on the public sector if you wish, not just in things like land use. You can also do it in residential buildings as well. You can, not rely on, people in private accommodation to essentially pay for it themselves. You could give subsidies. You could give greater support for electric vehicles, or you could give greater support for, heat pumps and all of those sorts of things. But that raises the public investment costs that then are borne here by the Scottish Government. And that interaction is really crucial about not just what does the Scottish Government invest or want to do in it, but what the UK Government does as well, because that has a big impact on the funding element. So if Scotland chooses to take a different path relative to the UK, then the funding wouldn't flow through in the same way, and it has to not just think about the spending element, it has to think about where the funding comes from. So so that's a really great question. I guess it's one of the interesting bits of the report, and how it's evolving the thinking around land use and where are the opportunities there. There's an interesting question about like the scale of investment. So in the early 2030s, you're looking at nearly 20% of the block grant, relative to today, and how this can be funded alongside other priorities. It's a great question, and I guess it's the really kind of, one of the key takeaways that you get from the analysis that we've done. So the first point, I guess, is that a large part of this will depend on that previous conversation we've just had about what might funding look like. So if the UK government decides to invest significantly in these areas, then the Scottish government, all else remaining equal, will get significantly more funding coming through, and that will then help them be able to meet these investments. But the UK government has got fiscal challenges as well. It's got its fiscal accounts to balance. So if significant additional funding doesn't come through, then essentially what the challenge comes to all political parties is a trade-off here, in that if you want to achieve net zero by 2045, these are the kind of broad projections about the level of investment that you're going to need. And that has to be funded from somewhere. If it's not coming through additional funding from the UK level, it's going to have to come through either raising revenues here in Scotland, or it's going to have to come through reprioritisation of capital investment from elsewhere in the budget. And that's not easy. That's not easy when there's pressures on the NHS, when there's pressures on other aspects of public transport, there's pressures on general public services. Whoever forms the next government is going to have to make some really quite difficult choices in how it prioritises all of that. The one thing I would say, though, and it's really important that we never lose sight of this, is that the status quo is not a neutral option. The status quo is not a fiscally positive scenario to compare to. As I mentioned, that if you look at the evidence about what happens if the climate does warm faster, than the targets are, that'll be a negative impact on the economy, and that in turn will impact on revenues. It will in turn mean that more expenditure is going to have to go into dealing with the damages of all of this. So doing nothing is not an option. This is the option that will deliver 2045 in terms of net zero, but it does require real careful prioritisation of budgets. And I guess we're really coming up to an election debate, real honesty from all political parties about what is the investment going to look like and where is the funding going to come from. There's a question there about the Scottish Government budget includes 4.9 billion in investment, but positive benefit for climate. How much of this covers the costs identified in your report? So the first thing I'd say is, so the Scottish Government have started to set much more information out about how the budget relates to their ambitions around climate change and relates to their ambitions about net zero. But what it hasn't really done yet is essentially have that really careful read through between the exact ambitions that they want to achieve in terms of reducing emissions, and then the specific policy choices and the costs attached to these policy choices that essentially are going to deliver all of that. So, the kind of that phrase that you use is very high level. It's very broad, but it could be interpreted in a whole variety of different ways. It's not saying this is what we're spending exactly on achieving the reduction in emissions that we need to get to net zero. And that's where I guess my final point at the end about that clarity needs to come through in the climate change plan, and that clarity also needs to come through in the spending review. So there's real consistency there between what the government are saying on the spending side, but also what they're saying on the climate side. So and that's what we don't yet have, and that's what it's going to be crucial over the next few months to do that. There's a question about extra devolved public investment on resource budgets and how much on the capital side. I mean, pretty much what we're talking about here is investment on the capital side within all of that. Of course, the government can transfer money from resources into capital. I think some of the more interesting things that we haven't done in this report that would be useful on the resource side are things like the potential costs of damages, the potential costs of mitigation. These are the sorts of things that are much more likely to appear on the resource side of the budget. Whereas what we're really looking at here is what's the big public investment that needs to go in, and that's primarily pretty much on the public investment side. But there's a question there about the great question about the emissions and the country of origin and materials supplied, etc., for public projects. I mean, pretty much Gregor, correct me if I'm wrong, but pretty much what we use is the kind of definition of territorial emissions. So that's our basic starting point. But there's a really important point about where are we sourcing a lot of the investment materials that will be going into this, and that gets into the consumption versus production. But pretty much we follow the CCC and the OBR in looking at territorial emissions.
Yeah, that's correct, and it's not just that's what the carbon budgets are set on. So I guess the carbon budgets are going through Parliament at the moment, but they're advised by the CCC, but they're on that territorial basis, and these are costs. These are the costs of those CCC for the Scottish Government. So though it is very important, and because it has knock-on effects for how much damages there would be about the consumption element, it's not something we've factored in because it's not currently government policy.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks, Gregor. We touched on this a wee bit already, just about about rejecting the recommendation on kind of livestock numbers, which I guess kind of comes into similar things around the land use and what does this mean for the budget. I mean, I guess, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, Gregor, but we haven't really specifically done scenario modeling, and that's typically not what we do, is kind of second guess what different scenarios would look like. What I guess we do instead is say, well, look, here's the potential range, and that's where the analysis around the kind of upper, central, and lower is really quite useful, because it just shows, well, yeah, if you don't follow the recommendations, say, in livestock numbers because of broader policy ambitions, if you choose to be more generous in terms of subsidies to private sector household owners, if you choose to be more generous on things like electric vehicles, etc., all of that is entirely possible to do, but it tots up into a more significant number. And I guess to answer that question, I guess that's where we really need the climate change plan and the spending review to basically set out the specifics of that, to say if you're rejecting that, what else are you doing in your climate change action in order to maintain yourself on the carbon budget plans that exist from the CCC? Because without that, then you're not going to meet what they've set out. Okay, good. Couple of final questions. So land use in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK, we touched on that a wee bit earlier, just about, yeah, it's much bigger in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. As I mentioned, we have the significantly, higher, greater proportion of land mass, which is an impact on Scotland. We also have, greater proportion of peatlands, etc. So all that investment essentially, will take place in Scotland, and that potentially is, and that's potentially going to be a significant opportunity as well, because there's going to be a significant level of public, not just public, but potentially, private or reprofiled public investment going into land use, which will particularly be significant in rural areas. What's the thing we'd most like to see in the Scottish Government's climate change plan? So I think we actually set out in our statement of data needs, didn't we, Gregor, last year, about what we thought would be really useful in all of this. And I guess this comes back to the question earlier about the kind of broad, high-level ambitions about we're spending this amount of money on climate change, ambitions. I think what we're really looking for, or would recommend, is real clarity in terms of detail. So you have these carbon budgets. What are the specific policies that you're going to put in place between now and the next few years that will deliver on these carbon budgets? What's the channels through which they'll have an impact? So you've got the real clarity about these are the mechanisms you're going to do. But then crucially, where is the funding coming from? So what's the fiscal dimension of all of this? So if we are saying you're going to have to invest £700 million on average every year into that, what is that? Where is that money coming from? What does it look like? What's the scale of that investment? And I guess the one thing to summarise that is just the real importance of the climate change plan linking through to the spending review and linking through to the budget. The two documents have got to be seen as one overall plan to use the public investment to achieve the government's net zero ambitions. They can't be two separate documents. Do we have plans to look at the cost of damages in future reports? Yes, ideally, yes. And this is one area where I think we are really keen to have a look at. I mean, one of the challenges is that there's quite a lot of limited information on that at the moment out there. But as colleagues the Climate Change Committee and the OBR do more work, then we'll be able to interact with that and think about what it might mean in a Scottish context. I think that is in the area, that alongside the adaptation costs, etc., will be an area of I think of real focus that'll be really interesting to do. And yeah, there's a question here about the differential distributional impacts of different approaches, e.g. higher taxes, higher subsidies versus households paying their own costs. So unfortunately, that kind of strays outside our remit about what the kind of distributional cost would be on individuals and all of that. What we are really trying to do is essentially say to the government, this is the scale of investment, these are the areas to prioritise, and these are some of the differences between Scotland and the rest of the UK. I think that suggestion is exactly the sort of thing that would be useful to see in things like the climate change plan and evidence supporting decisions in the spending review. So if this is a level of investment and you're choosing to use this fiscal lever for it, what are the impacts of that on the economy, on the distribution, on other broader objectives you have, whether that be tackling poverty, supporting the economy? That's the sort of thing which I think will be really important for the government to set out in their subsequent documents. Great. I think, Gregor, that's us got to the 45 minutes. So there's been some really good some questions there. So thanks so much for that. You can see our report on the Fiscal Commission website, and the slides and the recording of this presentation will be there as well. As I said, this is getting to quite an important time for government policy making in climate and the transition to net zero, with the climate change plan coming out in the coming months, but also, as I said, the spending review coming down the line, which is going to be a really important combination of documents that are going to set out, the plan that Scotland has in order to achieve net zero. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great pleasure to speak with you